Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Today is a very special day. We have the book launch by Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington, the Big Con. We're going to talk more about this, but before, I just want to say something. This year I've been in this room several times teaching, and also one time that when we were celebrating IPP 5th anniversary, that was 2 weeks ago, I guess. But 5 years ago, I was on the other side as a postdoc student, and I came for the first when the institute was founded. And as a postdoc, you think, wow, it would be amazing to work there one day, and it happened. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy. So, this book has been a success again. For Mariana, it's just another one on the shelf, being extremely successful. And Rosie is her first book and also fantastic work. So I welcome everybody, of course, on behalf of UCL IPP. And it's a huge pleasure to have all of you here to be able to discuss this book with colleagues across UCL as well. And, our institute is an institute that is putting forward new economic thinking, is impacting policy. So everything we do has ambition of change the world and make our society better. So the book is dedicated to colleagues at IPP and the research work they do rebuilding government and our economy for the common good. So I would like to spend a little bit of time introducing Mariana and Rosie. So Mariana, as probably everybody knows, is a professor in economics at UCL and a director of our Institute of Innovation in Public the IPP Innovation, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is a winner of international prizes, including, for example, I'm just going to mention one, the Grand Unofficial Ordinate, is that Italian, Mariana? Del Merito della Repubblica? Yeah. Italian. That's my Italian as far as it goes. But also many honors and other prizes, including the 2008 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. As economists, this is really important. Is a prize that really reflects how you're doing a fantastic work in economics. And of course, she's author of many, 4 highly acclaimed books. For example, The Entrepreneurial State, the book in Public versus Private Sector Myth, which is 10 years anniversary this year as well. And also The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the global economy. So I'm not going to go all of these books, but Mariana is a fantastic female economist. Is very important for us as well in the discipline because we don't have many female economists. And then there's here Rosie, who is a fantastic political economist, Rosie Collington. She's doing her PhD at IPP. And all of us, when you're doing a PhD, we dream about writing a book, and not many of us manage that. So Rosie, really well done. You show how special, how dedicated you are. She's working under the supervision of Mariana, and her research explores the political economy of health innovation and the role of the state in the value creation, which is fantastic and a subject that's very close to our heart at IPP. So, what I'd like to do now, we're going to spend time, of course, hearing a little bit from Mariana and Mazzucato, but we will follow this by a discussion. We have here Jeremy Oppenheim. Thank you very much for coming. And also John Elkington. But I don't want to introduce you both now, because I think you deserve an introduction on your own. So let's go to Mariana and Rosie, and when you move to discussion, we talk about your own journey. So thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. I'm not sure how many of you were in fact here 2 weeks ago when we had our 5th anniversary of the Institute and the 10th anniversary of the Entrepreneurial State, but this room is also quite historic. Apparently it's been in many movies, but it's quite also really nice that it was Carolina who introduced us, because Carolina is a new member of staff. She had the Joan Robinson Chair at the University of Cambridge, and Joan Robinson actually was one of the most important female economists, given that you mentioned that. But one of the things that we really try to do in IPP is to constantly make that link between the problems that are out there and the issues, the ways that assumptions, problematic assumptions, have actually been embedded in problematic theory that are not unlinked with those problems. So it's not possible to just have better policy, better climate policy, better health policy, tackling the digital divide without also questioning the theories, the framings, the narratives, the storytelling that has actually gotten us where we are. So kind of that need to tell new stories, but also to constantly make that link between theory and practice. And we call that practice-based theorizing. I just want to say right away that we're so grateful to Jeremy and John for coming tonight to be our discussants, because we've actually already done this book in different places, including at the Hay Festival, which is like the Glastonbury of books, for books. And we haven't, as of yet, had an explicit discussion with consultants. We've had lots of comments. So if you read the FT review when it first came out, lots of the commentary underneath came from, including from the Consulting Association. I didn't even know they existed. We've also been banned from certain conferences because Deloitte was the sponsor. But it's actually not a joke, and maybe we'll at some point name that conference. But which is, of course, the wrong reaction. In any situation, like imagine if people were criticizing academia, it would be so important to actually engage with that debate, regardless of what one's position is. And so it's very important for us going forwards with this book, because it's not just a book to do kind of an Oprah Winfrey discussion. It's actually a book to look for change. And I'm going to talk a bit now about why we need that change. But one of our dreams actually for the next months, and we'll talk to you more about this maybe even on stage later, but also afterwards, is to turn it also into an opportunity to workshop, right? And we in IBP do lots of workshops with civil servants, but also surely with consultants, with the business community, and ask how have we gotten into this place that we are, and what are the solutions? And the last chapter, by the way, does have solutions. We'll talk a bit about those, but let me just pause a bit and talk about why we wrote it. And so, as I mentioned, the Institute was set up 5 years ago precisely to rethink purpose and kind of public purpose. What does it mean to have purpose-oriented businesses, mission-oriented governments, other organizations in civil society who work together towards common goals? What does it mean for their ability to actually work together, to listen to each other, to drive collective intelligence at the center of how they work together, but also literally also questioning these ideas, for example, the background in terms of the theory, what would it mean if the government side within those relationships didn't see its role just as fixing market failures, waiting for things to kind of mess up or worrying about those things messing up to then make an investment or to create some sort of tax incentive. What would it look like if it was truly a purpose-oriented system, an ecosystem of different actors working together with collective intelligence, if those very policies were actually framed explicitly in terms of actively shaping and co-creating a different type of economy, right? Because the economy has not just a rate, but also direction. So that directionality, we can talk about it, whether we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, we can look at it whether we look at the kind of big ambitions of having more inclusive and sustainable growth. That can't just be about kind of tilting the playing field or fixing some market failures here and there. It really requires that kind of active, transformative interaction. And the reason the Institute was set up was really that the public side of that relationship of public-private and civil society, we believe has really been also under-theorized, precisely due to this kind of limit of thinking that it's at best, at worst, get out of the way, the kind of Reaganite, Thatcherite do, but at best, it's to fix different types of market failures. And so what is the new training that we actually require within the civil service, within the public service, the new design of a master's in public administration that would actually kind of meet that objective, right? Because if you look at the training, if you look out there at Masters in Public Administration programs, they're basically informed by kind of Chicago school economics around market failure thinking, which has then trickled down through public choice theory, new public management, different types of metrics that have come in from the private sector to the public sector around, for example, how you evaluate a public investment. So think of all the cost-benefit analysis, the net present value calculations that we have in the treasuries. What should replace that if actually the goal is to have a purpose-oriented economy where all the different actors are taking on risks, sharing risk, sharing awards. And again, the policy itself is about actively shaping a dynamic economy where lots of different sectors then work together to achieve those goals. And the reason I wrote Mission Economy, and I promise I'll get to this book in a second, is that I don't believe that today we would get to the moon. Right? We got to the moon 52 years ago with a very, very ambitious program that actually required a public direction, a direction that was set by government, but lots of private sector activity. There was 400,000 people involved in getting to the moon. There was lots of different sectors: nutrition, electronics, materials, software. You'll all have seen the film Hidden Figures. But what was really striking, and why I think things have changed so much, was literally the language, right? So Kennedy talked about, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means you need to embrace uncertainty. You have to be willing to experiment and to fail, but learn from those failures. And one of the stories I tell in the book is actually what then made me desire to write this book, The Big Con. There's the guy who was running public sector procurement inside NASA. His name was Ernest Brackett, who first of all came up with this outcomes-oriented procurement strategy within NASA, which actually then helped to crowd in all that private sector innovation. They got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, so on and so forth. But in that process of working with these private companies, he just realized how important it was for the government and for NASA itself to kind of know what it was doing when working with others, right? Because this has never been, and IPP never talks about the state versus the private sector. So it was about working together. And he was witnessing already in the 1960s this trend towards outsourcing public sector capacity to the private sector, which doesn't mean working with the private sector, that he really believed in, but outsourcing the brains of government to other organizations outside of government. And already McKinsey was one of those organizations who was looking at, and in looking at the kind of increasing consultification of NASA itself, he called out a warning. He said, if we continue to do this, we won't even know how to understand our own environment, our kind of landscape out there, technological, even market landscape. We won't know which private sector companies to work with. We won't understand even how to write the terms of reference, the contracts with the private companies. And to kind of sum up his opinion, he said, we will ultimately get captured by brochuremanship. This was his quote. Ernest Brackett, head of procurement in the 1960s in NASA, warned, if we continue to outsource our brains within the space agency, which, you know, of all government agencies is the theoretically most kind of mission-oriented, we won't know how to work with other actors. And this is basically what we think has happened. And it's not a complete dissing of civil servants globally. Actually, we very much appreciate the work that's being done in governments worldwide, but we believe in IPP, because we document this stuff, but also in the book, we argue that that's in fact what has happened. We have consultified our governments. We have taken away through also, as a result also of the ideological battle, right? You don't attack the state just by taking away budgets. Budgets come and go, but really kind of through a new remit of the state, again, fixing markets, administering, enabling, de-risking who? The risk takers, right? So if risk-taking and value creation is seen as just happening in business, and at best government can fix those market failures, it's not a surprise then that this idea that investments in capacity, in capabilities, in creative potential of organizations happens more in the private sector. So this call out that he was already making back in the 1960s around, you know, this danger of consultifying and outsourcing government capacity to the private sector wasn't just happening in a vacuum, was happening actually at a moment where a lot of these ideas, we can call it neoliberal ideas, but in the book we also look at the role of labor and the third way in more recent decades and continuing to propagate that view, that again, link between the theory and the practice. It wasn't just happening by chance. And in the book, we don't actually, even though Big Con, it sounds really kind of dramatic, it's not a book against consulting. In fact, one of the ways we actually begin the book, and maybe you can tell that story, because the way we're going to divide this up a bit is that Rosie's going to do more of the storytelling in the cases, is actually when consultants were really just consulting and advising on the sidelines. So this slow movement of the consulting industry, because we actually look at the large industry, it's about $1 trillion globally right now, It's divided with different types of consulting actors, some more on the accounting side, some more the strategy side, but together we're talking about $1 trillion worth of funds. We look at how that has slowly gone to the center, right, to the driver's seat. So the problem is not, should governments have advisors? Of course they should. If a government's going to have a cancer policy, you should bring in as consultants some of the top oncologists. When you're thinking about a new teaching policy, it would make sense to bring in, head teachers, again, for health, doctors, nurses, academics who might have spent decades studying something. That's normal to pay also for that service. Why should they be doing it for free? We look at what's happened to the business model and the industry. So the big bit is literally the big industry, the large names that you know, the McKinseys, the PwCs, the Deloittes, KPMGs, Boston Consulting Group, and we try to tackle it as a sector without just picking on one company. We look at why that has happened. And there's one chapter where we really look at how the history of recent capitalism has actually been a history of consulting. So these two things are actually related, including inside the business community. Some of the problems that different academics, including myself, have looked at, like financialization, the lack of reinvestment of profits back into the economy, over close to 10 trillion in the last 10 years, having been used for share buybacks. That itself, that dysfunctional corporate governance within business, has also been related to the way that consultants have interacted with the sector. But we really look at the business side and the government side differently. On the government side, what we look at is the risk that there is, precisely as I was just talking about, that when you have this consultification of the civil service stops learning, right? So Kennedy, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. It requires embracing that uncertainty, experimentation, learning by doing. When government is just thinking about itself as fixing market failures, it not only doesn't do that, but it prefers that the risks be taken elsewhere, right? If venture capitalists are allowed to be bragging about all the risks they took because for every success they have to also bear with 9 or 10 failures, civil servants aren't allowed to do that. If they make a mistake, they're front page of the Daily Mail. So that fear of risk-taking, that risk averseness within the civil service, we look at that as one of the key causes of also the motivation of governments actually bringing in consultants. To the point that even when they know that the consultants don't even have the capacity, don't have the expertise in that area, it seems like a safer bet. So think what happened in COVID when the UK government was spending over 1 million a day on test and trace by who? Deloitte. Deloitte actually failed quite miserably at that task, but it's not surprising. Again, the mistakes are not the problem. What was extraordinary was that, why did they hire them in the first place? Deloitte had no expertise, capacity. It was not an area that they had actually invested in over the decades that would have perhaps made sense during a health pandemic to bring in the consultants. So that the brand, the kind of idea that you can rubber stamp this policy as a Deloitte managed test and trace system, as opposed to what? As opposed to perhaps working with GDS, Government Digital Services, or again, academics or consultants that might have been brought in from either smaller consulting units, but with that capacity. And one of the problems is that if you're not actually investing within the government capacity to make those kinds of investments and to govern these very difficult challenges around climate, health, digital divide, you again, over time, actually this is very much related to your PhD that you're doing now, decay your ability to learn, right? So learning by doing, if you don't fall off a bike, you don't learn how to ride that bike. We looked also at really strange cases, like in the case of Australia, where they actually had made investments within the government on climate change, for example, climate change modeling, and also the governance of this very complex, wicked problem of climate change in an organization called CSIRO. And so in that case, even when they had made those investments, let alone the lack of those investments, right? Because that's also one of the things we look at, this fall in investments within government capacity, even when they're making those investments, then not using them because it's just easier, more convenient to have it done by somebody else in case things go belly up, right? Again, this fear of taking risks. Another thing I think that's important to say is that, as I mentioned from the beginning when I said Reaganite, Thatcherite's idea, government get out of the way, and that maybe would be in one's mind the period in which the consulting industry perhaps rose the most within governments. What's interesting is that that's not true. It is true that consulting went up during the Thatcher years from 6 million to 246 million at the end of her tenure. But one of the ways that actually the door was opened even wider for the sector was when governments that actually believed in government, right? So the political, how do you say, policy leaders, the politicians who did believe in government, that weren't saying government, get out of the way, didn't go that extra step to really ask themselves questions, and this sounds a bit self-serving, that IAPP asks itself, which is, well, what's the point of government? What is a new theory of the state? So it's not just big state, small state. What would it look like to actually measure public value creation? What is public purpose? What does a symbiotic versus a parasitic public-private partnership look like? And I often remind people that, biologists are more rigorous with the concept of ecosystems than economists, because you would immediately look at how the different actors are working together from a biological ecosystem point of view. So if you don't do that and you just say, no, we do believe in the state, we're not Thatcherites, but don't actually start creating new metrics that are not just these static metrics around cost benefit and net present value, and start bringing in through the public-private partnerships, the PFI kind of schemes, ideas that actually sit much more in the private sector, like cost benefit, net present value, and so on, then it's not surprising, actually, that consultants who have expertise in the private sector find it much, quite easy to kind of walk into those doors and bring those private sector metrics into government. And lastly, I'll just say, before I hand over to Rosie, who will spice it up a bit with some stories, that what we look at, again, are solutions. So there's different ways to do this, right? What would it look like, for example, if the contracts between companies and governments and the consultants in the middle were much more transparent about these processes? What would it look like if the contracts, for example, embedded learning, right? So if one sees a therapist and the therapist has that client for their entire life, you would start thinking, well, maybe they're not such a good therapist because the client is like stuck, right? We have that actually with governments, because often the consultants themselves might not have an incentive with their work with the government to actually increase that capacity. Why? It's not rocket science. They won't get the next contract, right? So embedding within the contracts a learning process is an interesting concept. Also embedding in the contracts these very explicit dangers of the conflicts of interest that we point to through the different stories. So the fact that often the same company, whether it's McKinsey or PwC, is on both sides of the street. So working with, say, Eskom, a state-owned enterprise in South Africa, while also working with the Treasury that's supposed to be regulating Eskom. So those kinds of things that are quite rampant. The latest case was just 2 weeks ago in Australia, where PwC was found to be working with the government in Australia on pricing medical devices, as well as with the medical device companies, and kind of gaming that pricing system, right? So this idea of being on both sides of the street, what would it look like if we actually got rigorous about making sure that that doesn't happen? But also conflicts of interest in terms of, if you are advising, like McKinsey was with Australia, with £6 million contract, the government on climate change, being much more transparent about whether they're also working for the 46 largest fossil fuel companies in the world. So again, the stories we tell are stories like that, but we're telling them not to just kind of, raise scandals around this. There's actually a very good two journalists from the New York Times that wrote a book, which is a journalistic treatment of these problems, which is also important, more like a scoop. It's called When McKinsey Comes to Town. What our book tries to do is use these different cases to reveal these dysfunctionalities, both in business and in government. In business, we look more at the why it's happening in terms of CEOs and managers not actually taking responsibility for the decisions they're making and preferring to have it just kind of rubber stamped with a consulting brand, right? So again, whether it's the share buybacks that I mentioned, whether it was the downsizing, the mergers and acquisitions trends that we had in the 1980s and the 1990s, instead of kind of owning those policies and having internal debates both with workers but also with shareholders, having it just come in as though it's coming in kind of, from the sky, rubber stamped by a consulting company. And there we call out the need for much more courage to own those policies and to have a much more explicit discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Rosie because I think the cases are really important in the book, again, not as a journalistic treatment, but as revealing these very problematic partnerships in the end. So a problematic partnership, not a good mutualistic partnership between the different actors that we know need to be working together in an economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, everyone can hear me. My microphone isn't. It's very hot at the front of the room.
Should we turn this off? This is like literally like a fireplace.
Yeah, it would be nice in the winter. No, yeah. So as Mariana has said, one of the things that we wanted to achieve with the book, we started thinking about this book. Thank you. This is great. This is a PhD supervisor relationship, as it should be. One of the things that we started looking at the book before the pandemic, right? We started thinking about some of these issues before the pandemic happened. Obviously, Mariana has been writing and researching public sector capabilities for quite a long time. I'd also been researching outsourcing in the NHS. I used to work at the British Heart Foundation since about 2017. So we were already very interested in these issues, and we had identified that this sector had become very, very big over quite a short period of time. So it was estimated to be worth about, I think, 100 million at the turn of the millennium. And as Mariana said, in 2021, it got close to $1 trillion globally. So it became very, very big. Not many people were paying attention to it. And, what if actually looking at this sector could tell us something? And then the pandemic hit. And suddenly in the UK and in many other countries around the world, the consultancies were front pages of the news. They were in the headlines, and people were wondering what they were doing in government. We started speaking to people working in government at this time, working with the consultants. We also spoke to a consultant who had been contracted to work in test and trace. And it was actually during this time as well that the Conservative Minister, Lord Theodore Agnew, coined the term infantilization, or described what was happening to the civil service during the pandemic as a process of infantilization. I think the quote that he said was something like, "We're depriving our brightest and best of working on the crunchiest issues of our time, and in the process infantilizing them." So just to put a bit more, I guess, meat on the bones of what that actually looks like in government, we wanted to look at the kind of micro level, or the more day-to-day level of how this process might happen. So I'll just read you something from the book, which was that one person who we spoke to, who worked in projects related to the pandemic response during the first year, told us that it became clear in the beginning that the government had contracted an unprecedented number of consultants, some of whom had been brought in via subcontracts with other consultancies. This scale, the huge amounts of people hired because of the fog of war stuff, the roving consultants, became an operational hindrance. He said, "The impression I had was that the organisation stood up so many new teams all at once, so there was always someone new wanting to talk to you about some new thing that was upcoming. But they often didn't even know what they were asking for. It just seemed like every project had loads of wandering Deloitte people. And it strikes me that the sheer volume of them that were around created the situation of these zombie emails just arriving all the time, asking really basic questions that we had to respond to, taking our attention away from actual work." So that's quite revealing of how some of these dynamics can not just prevent actual advice and actual help, actual capability being built through a partnership with an organisation. During the pandemic, which was also something that the government had never responded to, and don't we know that the UK government had not really invested in capabilities or for pandemic preparedness? So when the pandemic hit, of course, it was going to have to learn from other actors to an extent. But this dynamic, is almost kind of textbook how not to try to develop capabilities on the job. So we looked at that, but as Mariana has also touched on, we were pretty interested in some of these conflicts of interest that arise in the consulting industry. And one of the reasons we're interested in them is because the big three and the big four, which are the companies that we focus on in the book, they promise that there is a very strict wall between different parts of these very big organizations around the world. So, the people who are advising or working with governments on a particular issue related to tax of multinational technology companies, for example, will not then be the same people who are advising those multinational technology companies on how to avoid tax. Now, we know through investigative journalism, which has been very important, and also government inquiries of now quite a few cases or many cases where this has not been the case. And I'll talk about one very quickly now that has developed since the book has come out, and I guess attest to the afterlife that the book will unfortunately probably continue to have until our governments and we as societies try to address this issue. So in Australia, an Australian newspaper found in January of this year, I think it was, they managed to get access to emails showing that a very senior director at McKinsey, PwC Australia, who had been advising the Australian government on how to develop a tax system for multinational technology companies, so Silicon Valley-based companies primarily, actually, how to ensure that they were not avoiding paying tax in Australia. And he was advising the government on this between 2014 and 2017. At the same time, he was sharing information that he was getting from these meetings that he was having. I think he was chairing a meeting in the Australian government, and he was sharing this information with other people in the company who disclosed that it was very useful for them to secure new clients in this area. So they were then using this information. Well, this is what both the journalistic investigation and a subsequent very expensive government inquiry has uncovered, that or has kind of argued that PwC was using this information to secure new clients, with the promises that they would help them to avoid having to pay extra tax that the government was trying to implement. So that's quite a kind of obvious conflict of interest, and we've given evidence now to the Australian Senate inquiry into this. We actually wrote about in the book a parallel case that happened in 2013 in the UK, where there have been criminal proceedings into this case now in Australia. It wasn't criminal proceedings in the UK, but a public accounts inquiry investigation into the use of tax advisors in the Treasury found that all four of the big four accounting consultancies had seconded staff to help develop transfer pricing law. So transfer pricing is kind of an area of tax legislation related to tax havens. So it's very sensitive, very important the governments get it right. And they subsequently found that one of these so these companies had seconded more people than were actually working internally in the Treasury on this area at the time. So they were very influential, for one thing. And they subsequently found that one of these companies was using the fact that it had helped to develop this tax legislation in marketing material to attract new clients. So it was, again, very similar. Nothing criminal. It wasn't against the law, but it attests to the conflicts of interest that we see kind of across the sector. We point to other cases in Puerto Rico, for example, which a case you can read about in the book, and in South Africa with the involvement of different companies in ESCOM. Now, as Mariana said, we're interested in these cases not because they are quote unquote scandalous, right? We're actually more interested in the cases that don't become headlines. So McKinsey providing advice to the Puerto Rican government on how to restructure its debt, while it's also set to benefit from the debt restructuring process. That's headline grabbing in the United States. But a back office IT contract that goes to a contractor that has that is making promises that it won't keep, for example, is less likely to be super appealing to the public. So we are interested in what these kind of scandals might have in common, or what they might reveal, or perhaps they don't reveal, or maybe they aren't reminiscent, or maybe they don't epitomize everything. But what do some of these structures reveal about the developments in capitalism and transformations of government that have led to the infantilization of government bureaucracies and issues of conflicts of interest, which of course are an issue in democracy, because while they might be able to be managed by governments need to know about them in order to manage them in the first place. And if they don't know about them, then that's an issue for accountability in government. But we're now at a point where 4 months after the book has come out, we're contacted basically every day still by individual consultants within the big three and the big four, not senior directors, I will say. In fact, as Mariana mentioned, we have, and the BBC and the Financial Times have tried to get comments from the big three and the big four in response to the book, have tried to put our arguments to them, and we're met with a wall of silence. In fact, the BBC said very explicitly on their 5-part series, Magic Consulting, which I was part of and a few other academics were part of, and they also interviewed some former consultants. They tried to get comments from the big three and the big four on not just arguments I was making, but arguments other people were making, and were met with a wall of silence. We're trying to have, or we've been trying. We're very open to having these conversations and having debates with them, but the big three and the big four, unfortunately, have a strategy of silence, we believe. But what everyone else is interested in who is speaking to us is how then do we move beyond this? What is the path forward? What does good advice with governments look like? How do governments work with other organizations, individuals, actors? They may be organizations that call themselves consultancies. What sort of business models should they have that ensure that they don't have that the business model does not then kind of undermine any genuine kind of public purpose orientation that they might have? That's quite important. How should governments work with them to ensure that they are able to learn? How should governments expand their understanding of what constitutes a consultant, so they're not just turning to Deloitte or McKinsey by default, but actually thinking critically about where capabilities exist when they do meet challenges, and ultimately how do they ensure that they are using those partnerships to be able to rebuild capabilities internally in the long run. And I think that's what we're looking forward to talking about today.
Absolutely, and I just came back. First, let's clap.
Okay.
Just one quick thing to put on the table, but we don't have to discuss it now because I think this will definitely be something we can discuss together. I just came back from South Africa, where this idea of a captured state is very much in the kind of debate. Italy, where I'm from, has a very weak state, I would argue. In some ways, that's the history of the mafia. If you look at why we have the mafia, it's actually because of a weak state where people have to help each other through a mutual help organization called Società dei Beati Paoli, which ultimately became Cosa Nostra. So what do you do in countries with weak states, with weak capacity, right? So one of the reasons, again, that consultants are brought in, sometimes with very good intentions, is that the symptom of actually not investing in that state's capacity is that then COVID hits, and you need a commission for the COVID inquiry in Italy, which I was sitting in, where there was about 15 of us who were asked by the prime minister at the time, was Giuseppe Conte at the time, to be part of this inquiry. And then there's 13 McKinsey people also in the room. First of all, it was striking. I was the only one who was like, what? What's going on? And the answer, again, well-intentioned answer. This isn't about a conspiracy theory. The Italian civil service, they can't even write minutes. They can't do the PowerPoints. This is just going to increase the efficiency. Oh, and Mariana, they're working for free. Thank them. Right? So we look at that as well in the book in two different ways. One, in terms of lowballing, being in almost every single room, often for free, getting all sorts of information, and surprise, surprise, the contracts that later come, like now with the Next Gen EU, which is 2 trillion euros of support to different member states, including Italy, which got the biggest chunk. Where do those contracts go? How are those governed? That's not for free. But also that this is a vicious cycle that we need to break, because it's true sometimes that capacity isn't there, and it's sort of a joke that people can't take minutes, but something a bit more complex than that. So how do we rebuild that capacity? Hence, again, IAPP, but also other institutes dedicated to that question, while also, confronting the issues that we raise. But these have to happen, we think, simultaneously. It's not chronological. Otherwise, in the meantime, lots of problems arise.
Great. Thank you very much, Mariana and Rosie. So as Mariana, it's the second or third time I'm listening to them to talk about the book, and it's always fascinating, it's always different. So we all know, as Mariana mentioned, they've been talking about the book before. The book has been out there for over 4 months, but this event is a treat because we actually have two discussants from the consultancy industry that were here that were here to talk to us, to give them their views on the book. So it's not just a random comment on FT or a Twitter thread. And I really would like to highlight how this is special, and I want to do that, spending a little bit of time introducing these two discussants we have today. One of them is Jeremy Oppenheim, and please, if you want to join us, it would be lovely. So, Jeremy is the founder and senior partner of the SYSTEMIQ. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So, in 2016, Jeremy co-founded SYSTEMIQ, a big corporation dedicated to accelerating the delivery of the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals by transforming markets and business models in 5 key systems: nature and food, materials and circularity, energy, the built environment areas, and sustainable finance. So previously, Jeremy spent 24 years at McKinsey. So he really knows things from inside, I guess, developing and leading its sustainability and resource productivity practice. Jeremy started his career at the World Bank as economist, business advisor, and convener of coalitions. Jeremy is driven by one simple idea: tackling the big challenge of our time requires urgent structural change to our economic systems, which demands new levels of collaboration across business, government, and civil society. So this is just a taste of how special that day is having Jeremy with us. And we also have John Elkington. Please join us. So, John is a world authority on corporate responsibility and sustainable capitalism, a best-selling author and serial.
Give it up now.
They don't know yet. A serial entrepreneur. John is founder and chief Pollinator at Volans, which works with leaders to make sense of the emerging future to unlock tomorrow's market value. Volans tackles some of the world's most challenging problems, helping key actors expanding their focus from the responsibility agenda through resilience to regeneration. Much of the work is at board or C-suite level. John's thoughts leadership is evident in ongoing in Volans inquiries, including Project Breakthrough, Tomorrow's Capitalism Inquiry, and Green Swan Observatory. And I want to say something about John. So in 2009, he was named 4th in an international survey looking at the top 100 CSR leaders. So when I found out about this, I was like, okay, CRS leaders. And then I thought, but 4 out of 100, that's quite impressive. But it's even more impressive because before him, there was just 3 minor persons, which was Al Gore, Barack Obama, and the late Anita Roddick. So this is, I'm sorry if I'm taking a little bit the floor here, but I want to highlight how important this event is, the treat we have here with 2 people from inside the industry giving their views. So you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Right, well, first, Mariana and Rosie, thank you for writing the book and putting the issue on the table and kind of making it come to life.
Do people hear well, or should we use these?
Can you hear me? Yeah, we're good? Yeah. So I am, despite my 1,000 years at McKinsey, going to make 4 points, not 3. So I realise that I am breaking the template, but this is the consequence of having been out of McKinsey for the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what is the central challenge posed by the book, which I think we would all probably agree is not really about consultants at all, but is about the challenge of building a high-performing public sector. That is the central challenge. The second thing I want to talk about is what you can legitimately expect from the consulting industry. Is this an industry that is just like the fossil fuel industry going to reform itself or not? The third thing I want to talk about is what you might regard as elements of good practice when working with consulting firms and bringing, if you will, advisors, including academics, who are, of course, entirely innocent of any of the incentives operating on the consulting industry, but how to work with them in an effective way. And then I'd like to briefly, and I'll try and do this in 5 minutes, if that's okay. I will try and briefly channel Mariana's entrepreneurial state, just for a moment. So that's my... Point one, what's the central problem here? The central problem is that we've spent, certainly in the West, 50 years or more, shrinking the state, reducing its effective capabilities, making it, in some cases, excessively political, hollowing out various elements of it. It's all part of a broader, if you will, set of changes, not all of which were badly intentioned. So we shouldn't, there was, if you go back into the 50s and 60s, right, if we still had the state from the 50s and 60s today, we would not be happy with that. I can guarantee that, right? So there was a huge change that has, and I think there's a little bit of underestimating the degree of transformation that's ongoing in multiple elements of the state, including, if you will, central government, including public services. There's ongoing dramatic change taking place across what is an extraordinarily complex, large, interconnected system. So the challenge that we have is building a state and then a set of public services that are fit for the 21st century. I think really confident in the following assertion, that if you were looking to do the things that we need to do to make the state and the associated public services and the public-private partnerships that we need to have high-performing, whatever we mean by that, and we'll all have different definitions, the top 4 things that you would do to improve that performance would not include, we've got to fix the consultant issue, right? It might be on the top 10 list, but it wouldn't be on the top 4, because there are much deeper, much more fundamental root cause issues than fixing the consulting. So I don't want to take a shot at the book, but I think it's an easy thing to scapegoat the consultants. And what good consultants do is they focus on root causes. And they focus on the 3, at most 4 things that at any given time can be unlocked to drive the changes and the transformations we need to do. And they don't focus on the wrong problem. So I'm not defending any of the practices that Rosie and Mariana have described, but I do want us, if the book is a wake-up call for anything, it should be a wake-up call for what do we actually need to do to build the high-performing state and public services and systems. And I'm going to come back to that at the end, that we need. Observation 2, what can you expect from the consulting industry, which of course is many different industries, and it's not just the big 4 and the big 3 and the whatever. I sit in a firm that's an advisory firm, and you're very generous to the smaller boutique firms. They have their own problems, by the way. But just to be clear, do not expect that reform will come from within the consulting industry, right? Any more than you should ever expect deep reform to come within the fossil fuel sector, or any more than you should expect deep reform to come within the fast fashion industry. It will not happen. It's not the wiring or the incentive structure or the design, right? So you have to recognize the nature of the creature. They are, and it's not because any of the organizations are inherently, evil or malintended or any of these other things. It's stunning to some extent that there are that you can pick out the examples that you have of conflicts of interest and of, if you will, rogue consultants. On the whole, there's a lot of very good people doing good work, right, and who are very well behaved. And actually, many people are highly attuned to conflict of interests and highly principled. But nonetheless, this is an industry which, by design, to become a partner at a major advisory firm, just as it is the case to become an advisor in a major law firm or in any professional service environment, you have to generate revenues, right? And therefore you're driven into a growth model. And it is extraordinarily difficult once you're in a model which is about selling more to sell less, right? And kind of everything stems from that. It's not complicated. And so the government is not a particular victim of that phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that sits across every part of the interaction between the advisory, knowledge-based world and its clients, public, private, non-profit, you name it. So we should be clear about that as an unsurprising, fundamental driver of the behaviors and pathologies that sit within those organizations. It's not because people are trying to, if you will, undermine and infantilize. It's not the motivation, but it is inherent in a model which says we've got to kind of keep growing these enterprises because that's how they are set up to, if you will, build individual careers and align those individual careers with the institutional performance framework, which, by the way, in many cases are very dynamic and very rigorous and quote-unquote meritocratic. We can all debate what we mean by meritocracy, but it's important to recognize that. Number three, so if you can't expect the industry to reform itself because the underlying drivers are so powerful, right? And these are industries that are populated by very talented, ambitious, overachieving, insecure folk like myself, or at least I did the insecure bit. What is the set of good practices that need to be put in place? And they're kind of obvious, right? And they're not different for the public sector from the private sector. I mean, I spent probably 3/4 of my time serving private sector clients, not public sector clients, and you can have exactly the same conversation, literally the same conversation. Conflicts of interest, how to make sure that they are well managed. Proper, if you will, project life cycle management, which starts with clarity about the question that you're trying to get an answer to, and the appropriate, if you will, selection of consultants against a core exam question, through to what happens to, if you will, make sure that there's a beginning, middle, and end to that episode. How do you make sure that you build in learning and capability transfer? And then how to make sure, and this is something, and I'll just make a small self-interested pitch. One of the problems that SYSTEMIQ has as a specialized, I hope 21st century oriented kind of firm that works around all the issues that IPP cares about, is that we can't get a government contract because the barriers to entry, right, are so high. It is impossible, right, for us to deal with the procurement machinery. Absolutely impossible. Which, of course, has been put in place to manage conflicts of interest and to get this mythical thing called value for money, right, which itself is a huge problem. So the safeguards are not rocket science. I mean, don't think that I love the book as we all do. I don't need the basics of how do you engage with, manage, control, and get the very best out of advisors is very well known. It's very poorly executed, left, right, and centre. Last observation, and then I'll hand over to John, which is about channeling Mariana, if I might. So this is very dangerous. This is the dangerous part of the observation. So I think that that when we talk about the kind of state that we want, that state at its core is entrepreneurial in the way you describe, that has, if you will, the ambition not just to be correcting market failures, but to be shaping a deep set of, if you will, interactions and processes around the goals and the ambitions that should matter most in our society, whether it's on social justice, or on climate, or on urban renewal, or on nature, or on how we manage and regulate AI. The list is an endless list, right? The aging. These are the missions of our time. I would contend that it is impossible to imagine that those missions will be delivered by government on its own, even in the best version of the public sector, and I think we would agree. And so the question is, how does the state use the $1 trillion that you rightly describe? I don't know if that is the right number, but that's extraordinary commissioning power. Don't think of it as procurement. Think of it as commissioning power to shape the, if you will, the way in which these new processes need to operate, to shape, if you will, the emergence of new capabilities and knowledge distributed amongst a whole host of actors, not just in the public sector, but orchestrators. It's an orchestration role. And the fact that the government, so it's not about whether we infantilize the government or it's about envisaging a role of government that takes on the big challenges, plays a system orchestration game, and invites into that those, if you will, actors, which can include advisors, and it will include a whole range of different actors, to participate in shaping and in delivering and in evolving those missions in a way that creates benefits for society as a whole. And that is what the state, as a good, if you will, orchestrator and user and commissioner of advice, should be doing. And so please, let's turn the story on its head in a way. And yes, we need to fix some of the basics, but the unleashing the power of an entrepreneurial state to orchestrate the knowledge economy and the outcomes we need and bringing the different actors together in a radically different way, that's the future of what it means to get the relationship between state and the advisory business right.
Thank you.
I agree. I'm in a strange position here. I feel extremely fraudulent because I'm here as a consultant, and I have been a consultant for more or less 50 years now, and I've set up 4 companies through that period. The last 2 have been big corporations like SYSTEMIQ. But the third one, sustainability, which we set up in 1987, is now owned by, of all people, KKR, the private equity people. If you told me when we were setting up that small company, sustainability, in the kitchen of my own home, that that would be the consequence, that would be the outcome, I'd have probably jumped out of the nearest window, but that would have been on the ground floor, so it wouldn't have had much impact. But the reason I go through that is because I'm now slightly more relaxed about it, because I think the institutions of modern capitalism are starting to wake up to climate change, to some of these other wider challenges, and trying to address them. But very centrally in the book that you have done, you ask the question, in effect, is it a good thing if the big 3 and the big 4 embrace climate change or the climate emergency? And I'm not sure. I'm conflicted. I think it's a good thing if SYSTEMIQ embraces it, because they bring a very different mindset and skill set to bear. But having watched some of these very large consultancies at very close quarters over a long period of time, I'm not persuaded that their longer-term impact is what we actually need. It's incremental. It's playing by the rules that clients are comfortable setting at the particular period of time. And I read yesterday, I was saying to Mariana before we came on the stage, I read the book yesterday in the sub-basement of Chatham House between 2 sessions. I didn't read it cover to cover, but I read enough of it to understand. Firstly, it's extremely well written. It's very readable. It's very powerful. But the moment where it became personal for me was on page 217. where I read the story about Shell back in the late 1990s. And this small boutique environmental consultancy that was helping Shell at that stage, that was sustainability. And what wasn't mentioned in the story in the book, and I'm only telling it because to establish my mutant status, when we finally went into Shell after 2 years of refusing to work with them after Brent Spar and the Nigerian Ken Saro-Wiwa's execution and his execution of his colleagues, we were working on them on a number of fronts. One particularly was on their first sort of sustainability or triple bottom line reporting. But at the same time, and your point was, at the same time they were, and many companies that were starting to do this sort of work, were lobbying behind the scenes, lobbying government to slow down progress or stop it entirely if they possibly could. We launched a project. And the project was to look at corporate lobbying. And 2 clients of ours then asked us to shut the project down, Ford and Shell. We refused to shut it down. We went ahead with it. But I'm just making the point that there have been, throughout this period of history, the last sort of 30-some years, people who have brought a consulting model that is distinctly different. And I think quite a number of people who were activists and campaigners came into this space, set up consultancy, and have done spectacularly good work. I agree with Jeremy. I think there are some wonderful people in the big consultancies. But overall, I wonder whether we really don't have to sort of almost blow it up and start again. I mean, we're not going to be able to do that. I agree with Jeremy. We can't get this sector to transform itself. So somehow we've got to do it to them or for them over time. Final point is, you'll have gathered from what I've said to date, is that we mainly work with business. We refuse, if we possibly can, to work with government in any shape, size, or form, because I've done, and I like at the end of the year to be able to sit back and say, because we were involved, X, Y, and Z happened. I found that almost impossible in government, and that's probably a personal failing. But that both sides of the road argument that you're advancing or spotlighting is I think it's crucial. I'm not trying to wriggle out of it by saying it's not something we do, but it's not something I see directly in much of the work that we do. I suppose one of the questions I would leave for you both is, what exceptions did you see to the rule that you're stating here, in terms of what big consultancies or units within consultancies that you looked at did you see who were doing spectacularly good work that you rolled out and deployed elsewhere?
Great.
Thank you very much, Jeremy and John. So I just want to highlight that we are a tiny bit late, like half an hour. But so if you have to leave the room at 8:30, please someone let me know, and then I can, organize things. But for now, we need to spend some time listening Rosie and Mariana replying to Jeremy and John.
Great, and then we're going to also do Q&A, is that right? Good, should I take this one? So first of all, thank you so much, super enlightening, which we knew you would be. And I'm going to try to say this in a non-defensive way, but maybe I'm being defensive. I have no idea. It's not a late night, but been lots of travels around recently. So this is not a book that stands on its own, right? This is a book after many arguments, precisely arguing for what you just said. All the work that we've done, including the book itself, Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, was not about the state doing everything. It was actually about collective intelligence. The point about the moon landing was not that the modern day problems, whether it's health or environment, are as easy as going to the moon. They're actually much harder. Hence, the state needs that capacity, that creative capacity to think out of the box, to be agile, flexible, to do what? To work with others. Precisely that. I like how you put that. It's not just about procurement, it's about commissioning. We look a lot in the Institute. We have PhD students and postdocs and different projects looking precisely at what can we learn on the ground when actually the state it has been able to redesign its instruments in order to crowd in, to catalyze, to convene, but to get stuff done, right? So the procurement point, what's interesting is simply that procurement is a huge percentage of every government's budget, often close to 40%, but it's wasted. It's wasted unless it's outcomes oriented, really ambitious, like the work we're doing with Sweden on healthy, tasty school meals. It's not about the state delivering those school meals. It's about being really ambitious at a moonshot level about lunch, right? And then thinking, how can you use that to, again, work with the most innovative small and medium enterprises that are willing, so not picking winners, but picking the willing to work with you to deliver something as important as healthy, tasty, sustainable lunch to millions of children. So that's the objective. That's why we set up the Institute. That's the theme of the previous 3 books. But this is the elephant in the room. It's the emperor with no clothes. So either we just ignore it and just say, okay, someone go fix that, or looking at it, not in the scandalistic way, and again, just read the newspapers, almost every day there's the scandals, often crimes, right? McKinsey actually was behind the 600, how many billions in the opioid pandemic?
600 and something million, they said.
Yeah, McKinsey was actually behind the opioid crisis in the US and ended up, in one of the rare occasions, actually paying a massive fine, something like 600 million. That's, again, interesting. We can talk about it. It can be used to criticize a company. That's not the point. The point of the book is to look at this problem, and we're not the ones saying it's a problem. It's in every single newspaper almost every day, and saying, why is this happening? How can we tackle it at its source? But also, precisely as you said, not blaming the consultants, in some ways blaming the governments that have stopped investing within their capacity to govern, to commission, to work with others, being captured by brochuremanship. Ernest Brackett's words and Lord Agnew's words, and infantilizing the civil service. So completely agree with you. I think where I disagree is, of course it has to be fixed, but it doesn't get fixed as a symptom, right? It gets fixed at the cause. It is a symptom, the symptom of governments not investing in their capacity. But then it is such a not only large industry, but unfortunately an absorber of talent. We're going to have drinks downstairs later in a beautiful part of the cloisters where almost every week they do job fairs. And hopefully this will be a wake-up call for the students in the room not to go to that job fair. But anyway, with, the consulting companies often getting the best and the brightest. Again, not their fault. Why is it that the governments themselves aren't able to attract that kind of talent globally? We, again, look at that. We look at, would you want to go work in government if the point was simply to do, a carbon tax or a tax incentive for Elon Musk because you want to have a green transition? Or do you actually have to talk about, exactly as you were talking about, thinking of the role of government at the center, not at the periphery?
You wouldn't want the consulting industry or any industry to sort of degrade its offer to talent and to your students, would you? Sorry, you wouldn't, Mariana, you're not suggesting that the advisory or any industry should degrade the offer that it's making to your students.
No, but that's not what we're arguing at all.
So the thesis has got to be all around what will make the public sector offer stunning, right?
Yes,
and attractive
exactly.
and exciting.
But
That's what we say. That's what we argue.
That's what the book's about.
And that is something that can only be fixed within the public sector and the political system itself.
Yes, but not only.
Okay, I don't mind about this, but we need to use the mic.
Yeah.
So we agree.
Yeah.
That is the key argument in the book.
So that's one of the arguments. But I would also push back on this, what you said earlier. So 2 things about how consultancies, and thank you both very much for your comments, and I completely agree with pretty much everything you said. On this point of talent and why so many brilliant people go and work for consultancies, we're very clear about this in the book. The issue with the consulting industry is not individual consultants. There are many brilliant, well-meaning, hugely talented people working in the big 3 and the big 4. I've got 2 political science degrees, and frankly, most of my class, a lot of my good friends went to work for these companies. They're brilliant people. That's why we spent time not just interviewing consultants, but also researching the recruitment material of these firms, because we're interested in the promises that they're making to young consultants and young graduates. And they say things like, and you can do this yourself, you can do your own research, go and have a look at McKinsey or PwC's recruitment portals. And they say, You will be at the forefront of the green transition. You will be able to make an impact. You will be someone who keeps learning. We will support your development. You will get lots of experience in lots of different parts of the world. And guess what? We'll be able to pay you a salary that means you'll be able to still pay rent in London. Like, they're making all of these promises
Shocking.
that frankly, many places in the world aren't offering. We do know that lots of people are leaving this sector, and the Financial Times recently did a piece on this because they are disillusioned, because once they've worked in these positions, they find that isn't the case, and they are people who want to have an impact. But you know, our argument at the end of the book is precisely this: that this requires transforming government and the wider economy. But fundamentally, in order to understand the problem, and this isn't, you know, you also said that this is kind of common knowledge, you know, or this is common knowledge, it's just not executed. I would beg to differ, you know, based on many conversations that we've had, and also work, you know, and research that we've done with governments around the world. I was speaking with Pakistan's it's called Pakistan International Development Economics. It's the biggest kind of economics think tank in Pakistan. And they said to me, thank God you've written, and not to be like, oh, well done us or anything like this. But they said, you know, we've been trying to get this out for years, and none of the development banks that fund us are listening to us. They just keep paying for consultants to come and work in our governments, and we need more people to be talking about this. And you're right that this, you know, government is lots of different things. So some parts of governments you won't find many consultants, but many other parts of governments you will find many consultants where they could be investing internally and developing capabilities internally.
In order to work with others.
In order to work with others, that's also part. So I won't go into. I had some notes on learning by doing and learning by searching. So some of this more, I guess, theoretical stuff that's in my PhD that we probably don't have time to, but why it's important to do stuff in order to be able to actually contract properly later on. Absorptive capacity, yeah.
Okay, great. So, Jeremy, can we move to more questions? That's fantastic. So, you know, as a chair, I had, you know, one of the reasons I like to be chair is just keep asking things, but I can see so many hands going up. So I think everybody wants to have their say. I know who are the first two, and then if I can get, Julia, do you want to keep like looking, because so I can see everyone. I know it's a sequence, but I noticed you here, hands up first.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is so exciting and I think, you know, really enthralling to engage with both the book and the rest of the panel. I have a comment and a question. My comment, as someone who has a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Oxford, and then subsequently we went to work for BCG for a few years. Now I was no longer there, and I had a great run, really great experience. To the recruitment point for the public sector, if they want to recruit university graduates, I think two key levers that need to occur from the public sector. One is go onto campus and, like the public sector entities and consultancies, market your jobs. You'll be surprised that Nairi Woods, who is the dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at our 10-year anniversary last year, commented saying, every year I get excellent, not just consultancies, private sector organizations that come and offer us jobs. Zero government agency has ever come to advertise a job to our student. When I ask them about this, they say, well, we have a government website that can go on themselves and find out. So I just want to make that comment. And the second is to pay well so that we can go and pay off our student debt.
Yes.
Amen to the Singaporean model, for example. The question is, if you want to collaborate more with the consulting industry as authors, how come the FT and some of these news articles that came out can be very kind of edgy, pushy, almost like punch in the face, you know, the big con argument that is frankly not incentivizing, I think, to the consultancies to come and collaborate. And I think there's, coming to your panel is really enlightening. I think there's a lot of opportunity for you to work with agencies, but not when it's like a stab knife kind of conversation.
Okay, so needless to say that you need to keep it short so we can go. I mean, I know everyone is really excited, but you know, let's just keep short. And I'm going to ask the panel to take notes so we can get like 3 or perhaps 4 questions, because you know I can say everybody wants to say something. Can I ask you guys to introduce yourself very quickly as well?
Thank you. John Martin, Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine at UCL. when seen from the Faculty of Medicine, it is surprising that none of you have spoken about evidence whether anything works or not. I found a complete lack of rigor, rigor that I have to apply. I mean, innovation in public purpose. Society wants me to not kill people primarily and to make people better. And I have to use a tool called the randomized controlled double-blind clinical trial so I know whether behavior works or not. So could you answer that challenge? How do you know, what is the evidence whether anything you do works or not, number one? Number two, could you conceive of a methodology to test whether it works or not?
Okay, hold, let's get two more. Next, there's someone in the middle. Oh, here you go, yeah.
I'm Antonius, a student in the UCL. Thank you for the great talks and also feedbacks. In my opinion, without consultancy, lots of government actors also leak confidential information to the private sector, corrupt government. Milton Friedman mentioned that there is no government, just peoples. So why we should believe in government, the ordinary people who give them more power than to our friends in consultant firm. How to rebuild government internal capability, then give them more power, but guarantee the better outcome that the professor just mentioned. Before, I respect all of your books, Mariana Mazzucato, for all of your books. This is just like how I respect that, to strengthen your point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, one more, and then you go there.
Thank you. Madeline Young, former EY manager, Ernst & Young Big Four in compliance and fraud investigation. So I've worked on government contracts. I can't go into it, non-disclosure agreements. So question about the challenging ecosystem of consulting and the inherent risks of that, at times, toxic environment. So hugely expensive, high performance, fast delivery compared to public sector and academia. Currently, I'm an academic. The question, no more comment, is how can governments dream to produce such fast and robust results without the monetary and material incentives and at times the toxic pressures, which are really a risk to our health, of private sector consulting working environments and private sector consulting industry rewards? And as an academic, those rewards, I miss them.
Thank you very much. So I ask the panel to please address the questions, but also trying to keep it short, if it's possible. And then we have another round. Thank you.
Yeah.
Where are the microphones?
We've got microphones.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We
You
don't.
have one? Yeah, they don't.
That's fine.
We need one here. Carolina, one microphone should stay here, I guess. Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you perhaps want to...
Which? Wanted to-
No, I think they answer first and then we can go afterwards. Yeah.
We're happy to come back to some degree. I mean, your question about our friends in consultancies, I think one of the things that worries me very often, and particularly in the global south, is very often people who serve in the consultancy role are indeed friends or sort of loose associates of governments or so on. And the question in my mind is, to what extent does the book properly address that issue and the revolving door function, where people very often are clients and then to some degree come out into the wider world. But to your question about how do you measure impact, I mean, one of the reasons I think SYSTEMIQ and my organization are B corporations is because there is a methodology that does apply to how you measure, or you try to measure, social and environmental impact over time. I don't know government well enough to know how those sorts of metrics apply there and how they're being developed, but maybe Jeremy does.
Definitely not. So let me just take three quick questions. One on the point about recruitment and value proposition on campus. I mean, I'm obviously going to agree with the observation that you made, and I would make the following observation, which also relates to your point about speed and scale and toxic. So SYSTEMIQ is an advisory firm. We don't pay what the big three or big four or whatever pay. We're somewhere in between, kind of those kind of numbers and the civil servant. So we're sort of in between and this is not trying to invite people to speak to me later. the reason people come to SYSTEMIQ is because they are driven by a combination of a belief that there's a mission orientation that they believe in deeply, that there is a professional environment where we get things done that is non-bureaucratic and non-hierarchical and all those good non-words, and that they're going to be in an environment where they will learn a tremendous amount very quickly, which is, by the way, part of the advisory, if you will, value talent proposition. So they're perfectly, people particularly of this new generation coming through are very willing to work in ways that aren't just about the money. They always have been, actually, but it does require you to go and win their hearts and minds and take the actions and then follow through, right? And so I think that there are all sorts of ways, right, to create, if you will, more entrepreneurial units within government, more, if you will, kind of the historically things like the delivery units and the strategy unit. There are multiple, and again, I don't think we should be just dissing the public sector. There are extraordinary parts of the public sector where you get that acceleration, and it's not just in Treasury and Foreign Office, they're all over the place. So we need to start singing the praises of that and encouraging them, I'm sure you do, right? And then actually making sure that those stories feed into the talent markets in a much more effective way. I think your question about evidence is a great question. I didn't write the book, so I can't comment on the quality of the evidence. So it's very hard, I think, to know how much value I'm not going to even begin to answer, on an average basis, what is the value add of, a process that involves consulting or doesn't involve consulting. But I think the test that you're proposing, which may need to be adapted, to say, can we measure the value add? Can we get systematic about when and how advisory support from outside adds to the delivery of the core objectives, and find ways to, across the experimental lab that is the public sector, to learn a lot more about good versus bad use of advisory support is absolutely right. I understand that.
So this,
and I heard you.
yeah. So it relates to your point. So we do cite a lot of evidence in the book, a lot of academic peer-reviewed journal articles that have been published, and a couple great academic books that are trying to measure how not just use of consultancy. So there's some great work by Andrew Sturdy, who's a professor of economics and management at Bristol, and colleagues. They've been looking at how use of management consultants in the NHS has contributed or not to the development of effectiveness and productivity in NHS CCG, so clinical commissioning groups, or what were CCGs, and they find that there is no evidence that it adds, in most cases, there's no evidence that it adds any effectiveness, or it does not increase effectiveness and productivity, and in some cases, it actually decreases effectiveness and productivity. So that's one study. I can point you to some more, but they are in the book. A great book by Christopher Hood and Ruth Dixon in 2015 called A Government That Works Better and Costs Less. And they were testing this argument that new public management reforms and outsourcing had led to an increase of productivity and efficiency in government. And they found, again, the reverse was true. And that was a whole book's worth of evidence. What we were trying to do with the book, and this comes to your point, what we were trying to do with the book is the ideas that the consulting sector is a neutral actor in our economies, that it is some kind of neutral broker of expertise, is what is already out there. As academics, part of I think a role of not all academics, but a role of academics can be to ensure that what we know about this sector and what we're doing based on our own research, because obviously some of our own peer-reviewed research is also in the book. One thing that we're trying to do is bring this to a wider audience, right? So if the dominant kind of idea that we all have about consultants is that they do no harm or they help to create efficiencies and they are a neutral actor in our economy, then actually what we argue is the counterpoint. So it's important to get that argument out there, rather than just be timid about it. And I completely agree with everything you said about recruitment in government. I think very few. In the UK, and it's very different in other countries, in both Chile and Denmark, which is, I live in Denmark and I've spent a long time doing research in Chile. In both those countries, there is a much more positive view of the role of government in the economy. So when I finished my master's degree in political science in Denmark, a lot of people wanted to go and work for the public sector. When I finished my political science degree in the UK, no one wanted to go and work for the public sector. And this is in political science, right? So there are ways to create, useful or kind of meaningful jobs in the public sector. But this is why we situate it in Mariana's wider work and the wider work of the Institute, because it's not just about this sector, it's not just about tweaks in government, it's about transforming how we all think about government, how we understand the potential that the role of government can play in our economies. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's little to add, but just to look a bit at the pay issue. So I think that's absolutely right, and many people would agree that would be one of the ways to attract, more talented young individuals into government, but that's not enough, right? So Singapore does pay something like $1 million to the heads of the ministries, but what's interesting, what actually attracts people to want to work in government has also to do with the remit. So it was very interesting when Obama, after the financial crisis, while here we managed to somehow blame the public sector, even though it was driven by private debt, we went on this massive wave of austerity in the country. So it's a fact. In the US, they had an $800 billion stimulus program, and they decided very explicitly, it all kind of went belly up because the whole Tea Party thing happened, but to use it to green the country. So Obama had a green policy that sat above the different ministries, but he went out and then said, we need a top person to come in and be the head of the Department of Energy. And he managed to get a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Steve Chu, a Chinese American, who was like, I'll be there. And he didn't do it because, of the pay. He didn't do it because that he was supposed to de-risk, the renewable energy companies. He did it because of the steering role. It was precisely actually this commissioning. This idea that it wasn't going to be all public sector, but it was going to be a really important moment where a lot of money was going to be used to steer green growth, right? So then, the devil's in the detail. How do you do it? What does it mean? For example, today we're working very closely, or not very closely, closely with the United States with the CHIPS Act. What does it mean to embed conditionality, instead of just getting public money thrown at a problem like the CHIPS problem in the US where they want sovereignty, to embed within that conditionality, making sure that the private sector that is benefiting from a public program isn't just using the profits for share buybacks, that actually reinvests that money into better working conditions, that it uses green procurement, so greening the supply chains. Similarly in Germany, because they have the Energiewende policy, they use that actually to redesign, rethink the role of a public bank. Again, it's not just the public bank in and of itself, but what does a public bank look like when it's really able to catalyze innovation within the private sector, because the conditions for a public loan are no longer, here's some money, do what you want, but you need to, in the case of the steel sector in Germany, they have to reduce their material content in order to get any public money. Like, that's what's interesting. But even know how to do that, how to embed those conditionalities, how to use a public bank, not just to give out subsidies, guarantees, loans for the companies to stay in place, but to transform. That's where, this all becomes interesting. But that is currently not how we talk about public banks. They're seen as lenders of last resort, as opposed to investors first resort. What does it mean to not talk about de-risking, but sharing risks, welcoming uncertainty, setting up gov labs like they have in both Chile and in Denmark, where government's allowed to kind of experiment? That's attractive, right? But that is in some ways the opposite of what we've seen in the last 30 years. And that's why, Jeremy, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is, again, kind of 90% of what we usually write about. What this was about was we're not going to actually solve that problem while not at the same time looking at this kind of pimple that needs to be burst. Because, you're right, the disease is much bigger. You could look at this as just a pimple, but actually the degree to which it is literally in every room, at the center of so many different government agencies, and reducing in many ways the confidence of those same civil servants, because this idea that the efficiency from the minute taking to the governing of the difficult challenges like test and trace have to be done on the outside, bringing back that confidence has to be both about these investments we've just talked about, but also kind of, again, uncovering this, emperor with no clothes, because actually the expertise, and this comes to your point about the FT article, it was a weird headline, and we can't control the headlines. One of the weirdest headlines on me was that I was the most terrifying economist in the Times. But if you actually read the interview with a woman journalist, she didn't say that, but it was the male editor that actually put the headline. That sort of happens sometimes with these articles. we don't say McKinsey are just a bunch of foolish people. The headline there was McKinsey and Deloitte don't know what they're doing. Right?
In
That
response
sounds
to
very
the French vaccine, you were talking about the French vaccine rollout, and you said they don't have expertise in this area, and they use that as the headline.
They use it as a general headline. We don't actually, or at least we tried not to. Perhaps we could have done it better. The book is not about saying consultants are evil, right? It is completely about the failure of governments to invest within their abilities to be dynamic, entrepreneurial, mission-oriented states, and the need for them to work with good consulting. What does that look like? We try to tackle that in the last chapter. That's not our area, by the way. This is a book in some ways that forced us to go out of our comfort zone, which is very much about making government smarter, capable, creative, and so on. How to work with consultants in this space? I think it's about actually, looking also at areas today, whether it's the digital divide, whether it's climate, and saying in some areas perhaps you don't need consultants, in others perhaps yes, but what does it look like to create those symbiotic ecosystems that embed learning and true collective intelligence? Which again, the 8 different vaccines that we have out there, that itself would be an interesting way to look at what does it mean to do collective intelligence in terms of sharing of knowledge between public and private actors that are both capable, but also that deliver on a deal, which is about the common good, so vaccinating the world instead of just ending up with lots of things, right? 8 vaccines and we didn't vaccinate the world.
And just to say one just quick observation, which may not appeal to everyone in this room. I mean, the professional service firms, whether they're advisory or in other fields, are also, in their own way, quite remarkable organizational forms. They do get work done. Whether you agree with all the work is a different matter. They attract great talent. They are very good at, if you will, knowledge sharing. They, in one way or another, find ways to engage in multiple sectors of the economy, right? And they bring all sorts of different disciplines together in quite agile forms. Now, when I describe them like that, you might turn around and go, well, there's some of that I'd like to see in the way government operates, right? That agility, that project orientation, that toxicity, use one version of it, but that relentless desire to actually be driving for results, the quality with which professional development and talent development takes place. So, there are unintended consequences, or maybe they're intended, I think I was very clear in saying the underlying model leads to a desire to, if you will, grow that professional pyramid, and that feeds the monster in various ways. But there are very specific, if you will, organizational attributes and features of those firms that would, at least in part, be highly desirable in many elements of what, Mariana, you're describing governments need to do going forward.
Okay, thank you. I know the panel feel that like you're in hell because it's too hot, not because of the discussion. But hold, sorry, that was a not good comparison. But hold a little bit because I saw a few like very excited people want to ask. So last round of questions. So Rosie, hold your comment.
It's fair. Your response.
Hi, thank you so much. Oh. Okay, hi, sorry. Thanks so much. It was a really brilliant conversation. And as someone who's a recent entrant into the world of development consultancy, I found this really interesting, and I have one question for all of you. I would really love for you to comment on the relationship between neo-colonialism and development consultancies and white consultants in brown and black countries coming with expertise to these countries and trying to sort of also the funding that these consultancies and the global funds and the green climate funds that they bring, they are sort of come with the strings attached of like, okay, but you have to work with subcontractors, you have to work with consultants. So I'd really love for you to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one up there. You can go. It is on.
Thanks for the brilliant insight. I'm from the Connected Places Network. So we are set up by the UK government to promote innovation in the UK. So can you please
Can't really hear you.
Hello? Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, thanks. Again, I'm from the Connected Places Catapult. So we are set up by the UK government to promote innovation in the UK. So we work quite a lot with consultants, big or small, to bid for like Innovate UK fundings. So the reality is, if you have a big consortium with some big names on it, it increases your chance to win. So organizations would love to work with big consultants. And I won't blame it because that's the nature of the market. And what's problematic is we think that the government lack of the, they tend to quite easily satisfy with the outputs produced, maybe a fabulous report from big consultants. They don't have the expertise or capacity to actually evaluate the long-term impact or what's become a positive outcome. So my question is, do you think public procurement should move more towards outcome-driven rather than the short-term output-driven?
Thank you.
Hi there, thank you so much. My name's Elrika. I'm an ex-MPA graduate from Birmingham, and I've been working in local government for nearly 5 years. So to cut a long story short, we have public services such as failing state schools, saturated health services, fuel poverty, frontline homelessness services, you name it. And then these public services organisations, they hire consultancies, typically from privileged backgrounds. And then what happens? They don't produce the results, they don't add value, they don't deliver the required improvements. But suddenly the consultancies are to blame. But surely the blame lies in the public sector organisations who choose to hire them because they don't have to. But what they could do is actually hire those from the communities that they're meant to serve. You know, people who are on benefits, people who've been to failing state schools themselves, people who have actually first-hand experience. So I just want to hear your comments about public sector organisations taking ownership over who they consult with.
Hold on, the last one, and then that's it. We're going to go for drinks. So, you go, please.
I'm Russell Gundry from Plexel. To the point about government capability, I was struck by when the NHS moved their model to separate the commissioning function. And my observations at the time, it was a big three consultancy set, a very complicated framework that the big four then had to answer, all under the auspices of transferring capability to staff, which I don't think actually happened, if we're honest. The issue, I think, is abstraction of purpose. So, you know, as a commissioning entity, if you have no connection to the purpose of what the entity is delivering, it seems to me that it's impossible to deliver value. The critical thing, I think, around Kennedy is that he said, I want to get a human on the moon. That's quite a compelling vision. To the climate change point, I don't see a compelling vision. I don't see that 1.5 degrees is compelling. And actually, I wonder if we're at risk of propagating the same issue, i.e. that we're setting a very complicated framework around sustainability and then having to pay external advisors to respond to that very complicated framework, but at the same time never really addressing the fundamental purpose of what those entities are delivering. I'd be curious about your comments on those two.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for another great round of questions. To come back to some points and also something Jeremy said, this issue of is it government or is it business or is it the sector itself? Now, I want to be very, very clear because this is also an issue. We talk about problems with government commissioning. It is a problem with how governments work with consultancies, but it is absolutely also a problem with the business model underpinning these companies, right? So these are not neutral advisors, as we said. And when we talk about how there is so much benevolence and well-intentioned action among particularly young consultants, for example, we are interested in how that might become distorted because, as we were discussing earlier, there is always the pursuit of future contracts, right? So the advice that is given to a government, how could that become affected by the fact that the consultancy might need to secure future contracts from that government department or other government departments, right? So that's what's really, I think, really important, and that would be, I guess, the challenge that I would put to specialist consultancies where there is this kind of genuine expertise, how do you develop a business model that ensures that the kind of values or the purpose of your organization is not undermined by the pursuit of future contracts? And I had a great conversation with someone who's from a consultancy company in Denmark, a small consultancy company, and they've started to measure themselves based on their emissions or how much they are helping companies to reduce emissions, right? So that they're very kind of smart about this. They also don't. That means that they also don't work with fossil fuel companies because they're pretty realistic about the fact that they're not going to reduce emissions through kind of disclosure in that way. So I think that's a challenge that the consulting industry itself. This is not just a problem of government. That's a challenge for the consulting industry, right? How do you, if you want to be an advisor working with government or business, how do you actually ensure that you are, doing something that is valuable and not kind of having these conflicts? On related to this with the ESG point, we have, the climate consulting point. I'll just answer this very quickly because one of the things that we talk about in the book is the boom in ESG advice, right? And how this became kind of a huge industry. So the climate consulting, sustainability consulting sector globally has mushroomed in the past couple of years, particularly since the Paris Agreement, which again is a very nice example of fossil fuel companies and other private sector actors turning around and saying, well, the problem is that governments have not regulated enough. That's why we're in this mess. Not that we are we're responsible for doing these emissions in the first place. But since the Paris Agreement, there has been a huge explosion in climate consulting. And as part of that, we've also seen the growth of ESG metrics across Europe and North America. So in the UK, there was 900 ESG frameworks in play in 2019. I think that's the stat we use in the book, or 700. Now, ESG is a great thing, right? We want companies to be disclosing their emissions and looking at these things. But what has the intense focus on ESG done to our wider understanding of the transformation of our economies and the things that are needed? All of this attention on ESG, and this is to quote the former Chief Investment Officer for Sustainability at BlackRock, he called it a dangerous distraction, right? And the consulting industry, the big three and the big four, have been very much at the heart with BlackRock and a few other companies of developing these frameworks and ensuring that they get a lot of attention. So what does all of our focus on that actually mean for our understanding of the other things that governments need to do? Disclosure won't get us to net zero. Disclosure won't get us to net zero alone. We need other things. We need actual investments in development.
I was going to take on your question, which I thought was excellent, because I think you addressed two different parts of the problem. One is that kind of lack of investment within, and that kind of overly relying on consulting, which then you talked about not adding value, and we look at that. And I think that question that was asked before about how do you actually measure the true value, what kind of metrics are there? I think that's fascinating. But one of the statistics, the institute is in the Bartlett, which is the School of the Built Environment here at UCL. A statistic I learned from an architect who now runs public practice. Her name is Pooja Agrawal. They're trying to bring top architects and designers back into the city. She says that it used to be over 60% of architects work for city councils. Now it's 0.7, less than 1%. So again, you can't just look at this stuff with the money. I mean, partly that's money, but also in terms of, again, the remit, what the city council is for, its own kind of diminishing worry, taking risks, who is actually attracted to go in, definitely is also a financial issue. One of the things we've been doing with Camden Council, I co-chaired with Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council, the Camden Renewal Commission, trying to bring this mission-oriented outcomes, not output-oriented approach that someone asked to the council. The first thing we did was to say, well, surely this isn't just about Camden having missions. Who's actually making those decisions? What does co-creation and participation mean for real? Not just at the end to make sure that the mission is just. Think of all the talk about the just energy transition that labor unions are fighting for, but the design of the mission in the first place, right? Whose voices are at the table? So that, for example, the clean growth mission of Camden is actually focused around housing estates. And the first thing that we did was to bring people who live in the housing estate to the table to actually talk about green growth, sustainability, sustainable living. What do people want? What does it need to transform food banks into food cooperatives so the people benefiting from the food bank are in charge, are the ones making the decisions of the sourcing of the food, which can be, again, a green food cooperative, but the big change there is who's actually making the decisions. One of the Camden missions, by the way, is on actually diversifying the decision-making power in Camden, so it's as diverse as the people of Camden, because Camden's incredibly diverse, but Camden Council itself is not in terms of where decisions are being made. So it's an incredibly important question. One of the things we're actually doing also in the Institute is setting up, not so much a consulting service, but actually bringing top women economists from the Global South together in a network of women economists who can also be advising governments. We're currently working with Mia Motley, with Petro, with Lula around Latin America, but often the advice that comes in, even from the academics, are like the old boy network, including, to be honest, the old girl network, right? I mean, I'm part of that elite. So how do we actually diversify, even forget the consultancy bit, but the advising that's coming from academia? Actually, I should name Carolina here. Her focus, which is amazing, partly one of the reasons that we hired Carolina, is her focus on decolonizing the economics curriculum itself, right? Because all these things have to, again, go back to the source. And just on that outcomes and outputs question, it's absolutely central. The reason we end up with really problematic static metrics like cost benefit, net present value, market failure fixing, is that we at best think about kind of outputs, right? You know, kind of waiting times in a hospital, as opposed to even asking what does it mean to have a health for all mission at the center of an NHS policy. And that's why one of the things we've tried to do in terms of the redesign of the policies is get away from this idea that an industrial strategy would just be a list of sectors to help, like the industrial, like the life sciences strategy. The UK government had these 5 sectors: life sciences, creative industries, finance, automotive, and aerospace. What would it mean to have an outcomes-oriented industrial strategy, a mission-oriented industrial strategy that's really bold on reducing the digital divide to zero, having net zero cities in terms of carbon neutrality, in terms of healthy aging, and then actually having all sectors be part of that. But that can only happen if the instruments, procurement, grants, loans, bailout schemes during a COVID recovery aren't just, again, giving money out as though commercialization itself was the mission. And by the way, NASA, a really interesting thing that's happened in NASA over the last 30 years is it actually moved away from a true kind of inspirational mission-oriented approach towards actually having to justify every dollar, the value for money point you made. And so this wave of commercialization in space, the problem is not that there's private sector in space, is when there's no ultimate goal of what we're actually trying to do together. So that convening power that NASA had with the moon landing, with 400,000 people, today is very different. And some of the top people are leaving NASA, right? There's this hemorrhaging of talent because of this narrative, that storytelling I talked about in the beginning, as though all the creativity and value creation has to be in the SpaceX kind of places. And the top people working in SpaceX came from NASA. And so that spillover effect, which is itself a positive revolving door, not the negative revolving door, won't happen if we actually stop attracting some of the top people into these public organizations, which ultimately can also lend their hand in a functional way to the private companies.
Thank you, Mariana. John, please.
Just a couple of things before we go and have drinks. The first is we're talking about the hollowing out of government, and it's a really important issue. I wonder over time whether we won't see the hollowing out of the consultancy sector as well because of AI. And if consulting is largely about technology transfer and information transfer, these new tools, these new technologies and so on, I think are going to have a huge impact. And then the question is who ends up owning the organizations that result from that. The final point, and this is sort of a little bit of a grenade in the ornamental pond, but I loved the book, but the bit that left me wondering, 4 question marks. Your diagnosis and prognosis I absolutely get, but your prescription for how we deal with this problem left me really wondering. I think you almost need a separate conversation to talk through how you think those 4 approaches to dealing with this problem, you know, from a vision for the civil service through to a mandate of transparency and declaring conflicts of interest. I don't think that's actually going to do the restructuring that we need.
Thank you, John. Jeremy?
Well, I stand between everyone and drinks. So fortunately, I have a half an hour only of comments to make. So I was stopped by the wonderful Viola, who I work with, from putting a 2x2 up on the screen, which I thought was the only thing that consultants should do. So on one axis, for those of you who are visually good at 2x2s, I had good consultants and bad consultants, and I had on the other horizontal axis, you know, good government and bad government. And I mean, the essence of the argument in this book is that what has happened is that these 4 quadrants are not the same size, right? The quadrant that is where really good government meets really good advisory work is smaller than the other 3, and in fact is shrinking, and it shrinks because there are a set of dynamics, right, that are generated by government on the one hand and by the consulting profession on the other. And therefore you have to, in my version of the world, where unfortunately AI accepted, the advisory business, the underlying incentives with and without AI remain part of, if you will, the driven by the people that they attract. The hard work's going to have to happen on the government axis. So that's kind of observation 1. Observation 2 is very simply that it's also a little bit too comfortable, this conversation, in terms of turning around, even though it's very hot, and saying, look, what happens in the private sector is that these guys just go after the money and they grow their business and they then hollow out government. And in the public sector, everybody's really nice. And everybody is...
Jeremy, we don't say
I don't think we said that.
So those of you who are working in this institute are probably much deeper scholars of Weber than I am, right? And dysfunctional behavior within governments, rent-seeking within governments. You give people unspecified and poorly described missions, and I guarantee you that it will generate massive amounts of rent-seeking within the public sector as well. So let's not imagine that there's somehow different sort of DNA kind of gene pools that are operating. What we need to do is understand that both, if you will, sides of the equation need to change in a very deep way. And I'll leave you with what consultants of course do, is to offer you an acronym, or at least 4, because you couldn't do 25 years at McKinsey without going. So at the heart of this are, I think, 4 P's, right? One is around purpose, right? The heart of getting all this right. The second is around creating, if you will, within government, organizations that feel they have potential to take real action. So your point about mandate, there has to be a drive around performance for all actors in the system, absolute drive around performance, and then we need to go back to that value proposition for people. So maybe I should leave it there. Purpose, potential for real action. You've got to have that potential. Performance and people.
Perfect. 4 Ps. That's good.